Okay, another practical on-ground presentation, partnering with Beaver for cheap and cheerful restoration to provide a population benefit to an endangered species. Nick Bouwes is owner of the consulting firm. I pulled it up, but it pulled up. Is that okay?
Yep, that's it.
Oh, okay. Nick Bouwes is owner of an environmental consulting firm, Ecological Research, and has been doing really interesting on-ground change the system to allow the system to be natural. Thanks, Nick. I'm going to give you the 10, 5, 2, and stop.
Okay. Oh, do I have a, oh, here we go.
Yeah, and you know the middle one is a red.
Okay. Well, like Alex, I have my 3 favorite words in scientific inquiry that I repeat to myself every day. That's beaver, steelhead, and I forget what the third one is. So this is my study site, the Columbia River Basin. Columbia River Basin is historically used to be one of the most productive basins in North America, definitely the lower 48 for salmon and steelhead, with about 13 million fish returning every year. Over the past 100 years, these populations have seen significant declines. And main stem dams on the Columbia and Snake have been thought to be some of the most lethal impacts to these populations. And they've been deemed to pose jeopardy, and so now these populations are listed under the Endangered Species Act, which requires NOAA Fisheries to develop a biological opinion on how to manage this system. And they're relying a lot on stream restoration to ameliorate legacy effects from land use activities such as mining, timber harvest, agriculture, and cattle grazing, in hopes to recover these populations. Perhaps less widely appreciated is the loss of these critters in this region as an impact to salmon and steelhead as well. Beavers are generalists. They're found pretty much wherever there's water and adequate vegetation, which is the dark gray area on this map. While their historic ranges are similar to what they were pre-European settlement, the number of beaver are probably an order of magnitude less by all crude accounts. But they were a lot lower densities than they are now. Beaver hair is barbed, and that makes great felting properties, and so beaver pelts were used to make top hats. That was the fashion for 300 years. 300 years of trapping for this top hat led to the near extirpation of these critters throughout Eurasia and North America. This is a map of the timing of trapping, which just precedes the map of colonization of the United States, which means that in search of more beaver led to basically our exploration and colonization of the U.S., much like the gold rush, but in a far more reaching story. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, this was a joint territories in the early 1800s, and there's a joint territories between the British and the U.S., and the Hudson Bay Company, that was a British company, implemented the policy of a scorched streams policy, which was to try to trap out all beaver to discourage settlement in the region from the U.S. And so, fortunately, in 1825, the silk hat was introduced in Paris, and so the new fashion replaced the old fashion, which probably prevented the extinction of these species. But the damage was done by the early 1900s. Most of the beaver were extirpated from the Pacific Northwest. So we've heard a lot about beaver. Beaver are becoming a very popular topic. because of their ecosystem services they provide. But there are still a lot of people that doubt whether beaver and salamanders could coexist, even though these species have coexisted for ages at orders of, each order of magnitude higher densities than we see now. So we're partnering with beaver because of the large impacts they can have on ecosystems. We're partnering with beaver to try to improve fish habitat for listed steelhead under the Endangered Species Act. I would like to acknowledge co-authors here. I work with some folks that work with me in my company, and NOAA Fisheries, other consulting firms, and then Joe Wheaton, who's a faculty member here. My story takes place in Bridge Creek. Bridge Creek is a tributary to the John Day Basin, which is a tributary to the Columbia River. This has the potential to be a highly productive steelhead stream, but intensive agriculture and grazing and the removal of beaver, along with climatic conditions, led to the perfect storm that resulted in an incising of this channel. And from a fish's perspective, this is a relatively boring channel. This is Bridge Creek. In this trench with strips of willow for riparian vegetation, it's basically a steep, plain bed channel with very little complexity, not great fish habitat. And this is Bridge Creek in John Day. This isn't just a story about Bridge Creek. Channel incision is common throughout the Columbia River Basin. Just a cursory attempt to try to document how much channel incision is throughout the Columbia River Basin. There's potentially up to 15,000 kilometers of stream that are potentially incised. And as we've heard today, we see this in Utah. In fact, we see this all over the world. Channel incision is a common degraded state of streams. So I'm going to go through a four-phase evolutionary model of channel incision that was recently described by Kluwer and Thorne. Channels that are kind of in equilibrium between aggradation and degradation and are connected to their floodplain and can support riparian vegetation can undergo an incision event that could be fairly rapid. When that occurs, you get an entrenched stream. It's often a steep stream, very little sinuosity, and you often end up with riparian vegetation that no longer has access to the phreatic water, and you lose that vegetation as the water table drops. Second stage, the second stage is beginning to get erosion of those stream banks and a widening of the channel that allows for inset floodplains to develop, some establishment of riparian vegetation. Phase 3 is aggradation, as you start to get more sinuosity in this slightly widened channel because of a lack of stream power and ability to move sediment downstream. And eventually the system aggrades back to reconnection to its former floodplain. But this cycle can take up to 1,000 years, and for an endangered species, this isn't really a good time frame to be working with. We recently published an article in Bioscience that suggests that beavers can greatly accelerate this process of channel aggradation and reconnecting to the floodplain after a channel incision event. What commonly occurs is beavers build dams in these channels, but since they're entrenched, there's not a lot of material to work with, the dams often are short-lived and they breach, and that often results in bank erosion and widening. They build dams again, you get more aggradation behind those dams, development of riparian vegetation, emergent vegetation, capturing a lot of the sediment. And you quickly can start to aggrade the system and create a more multi-threaded system, highly complex system that has access to these inset floodplains that can dissipate energy rather quickly. And this can occur in 10 to 100 years, so a much shorter time frame. This is Bridge Creek. These are dams in Bridge Creek, and this is a common site. They make their dams with willows that are about the size of my thumb in diameter. We've documented aggradation behind this of up to 1 meter a year, but these dams don't have a lot of large material in them, and they blow out and we lose that aggradation. And so this is a common site in Bridge Creek. Almost on an annual basis, we lose these dams. So we're trying to come up with an approach to increase the persistence of these dams to accelerate that aggradation process. So what is this cheap and cheerful restoration all about? Well, that's a term that I'm going to blame Joe Wheaton for coining. I was a little dubious about it myself. I got the cheap part. I wasn't really sure what the cheerful meant, but apparently this is a common phrase in England where he spent some time. And I looked it up, and it says, not of bad quality despite being cheap. And then I saw a sentence, an example of how it's used in a sentence. They want something that is cheap and cheerful that does the job. And I was like, oh, that is what we're looking for. We're looking for cheap and cheerful approaches to do stream restoration. We need process-based restorations that are a lot cheaper than what we're using currently. We have limited funds. Here's a breakdown of average stream restoration costs that Brian Baer did. Bottom line is stream restoration is pretty expensive the way it's being done currently, with a cost of about 81,000 kilometers, $81,000 per kilometer. If we were to try to repair a lot of streams, that would cost a lot of money if it worked. Thing is, we don't have a whole lot of evidence to suggest that stream restoration is actually working in terms of repairing fish habitat, and especially in terms of whether it has a fish population response. There's just a few articles out there that can demonstrate that linkage. So for example, this is how someone might fix a incised channel. They might take an idealized plan form and build it next to the incised channel, fill in the old incised channel, and you got this perfect stream. You can imagine this is very expensive, very invasive, and it's highly uncertain what happens if you just move the stream over. So we need cheaper ways to approach this problem. And so the approach that we're using is to just simply put in wood posts in the streams perpendicular to the stream that adds some stability that either we reinforce dams or beavers build off of them. So here's a hydraulic post pounder pounding in these $2 to $5 posts. It takes about an hour to put in 20 of these posts, and so we can build a structure, for a couple $100. And so, like I said, we've put in we've reinforced existing dams, and we've built our own beaver dam analogs. We take willow and weave it in between these posts, and we create our own beaver dams. We're not as good at it as the beaver, but we're getting there. And in the bioscience paper, we suggest that we can use this technique to also quickly repair streams, perhaps even quicker, because we can start to put these in key locations to start the different phases of this channel incision process. So the question in Bridge Creek is, can we use beavers and beaver dam analogs to help restore a system that's very simplified, that's not great fish habitat, using this approach? So the expected changes that we see when we put in these structures, here's a structure here, and this is higher water, is that we increase the persistence of the dam. We get aggradation behind that dam as we slow water down, so sediment gets deposited behind that dam, and we get channel aggradation. With the raising of the stream bottom and the increased crest level from the dam, we get more inundation of the floodplain and reconnection of the floodplain, which we expect to increase riparian vegetation recruitment and increase the groundwater storage. And for a whole host of reasons, we expect that putting in these speed bumps are going to change habitat complexity for fish. Changes in water depth, velocity, substrate, temperature, and refugia. We're trying to provide variability in these variables so that fish can make decisions of where to rest, where to forage, where to hide from predators, where to hide from high flow events during floods, and so on. So as we mentioned, we're doing this as an experimental restoration project at the watershed scale. And most of the money for this project is actually documenting whether restoration works rather than doing the restoration. We just are fortunate enough to be trying a somewhat novel approach to doing restoration. But this is an intensely monitored watershed, and there's a network of these throughout the Columbia River Basin. And this is our experimental design. We have treatment and control reaches where we've been monitoring pre and post treatment. So we've been monitoring the system for fish and habitat since 2007. We have treatment reaches in the red and control reaches. This is actually should be 2015 because we got delayed a year. Will eventually also be a treatment. So it's the staircase design, and we compare treatments to our controls. We have controls in other tributaries, and we have controls. Another control is a whole watershed, which we expect to share similar climatic experiences, main stem, ocean conditions, and things like that that affect the life cycle of a salmon and a steelhead. We've been collecting fish in the system since 2007. We shock 3 times a year, and every fish we capture, we put a passive integrated transponder tag in. We've tagged so far about 50,000 fish, and we have antennas in the system that track their movement, and we also have antennas equipped with GPS. The difference in recapture rates and stuff can tell us about survival, abundance, and growth. So that is the methods. Here is documentation of the number of dams and bridge creeks. And fortunately, we have a time series of dam surveys in Bridge Creek that were done by Rick Demers and Bob Beshta, who will be talking tomorrow. So we have, since 1988, the number of dams. The dark line is the total number of dams in Bridge Creek, and we have pre versus post. And what you can see is that we've tripled the number of active beaver dams and functioning beaver dam analogs to the highest levels we ever saw in Bridge Creek. Again, they're short-lived, so even though we get a lot of dams, they can breach. The solid lines are our treatments. That's where most of the structures went in. But what I want to show here is that we also getting an increase of dams in our control reaches, meaning since we don't have any structures, we're kind of creating source populations of beavers that are starting to build dams elsewhere throughout the system. Okay, I'm going to talk first about the fish response. We've surveyed fish in ponded areas and non-ponded areas. The non-ponded areas are what Bridge Creek looked like the majority of the length, and the ponded areas are the beaver dam complexes, and what we see is there's a preference for fish for all seasons to be in beaver ponds. I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing how we interpret a graph like this. This is density of fish in our treatment watershed, Bridge Creek, and our control watershed, Murders. And this is an intervention analysis. And basically what you do is you subtract your control amount from your treatment amount for every point. So we start 2007 to 2013. So if there's more fish in our control watershed, we'll have a negative amount of fish here. This is the difference, and this is the 0 line. If we have more fish in our treatment and we subtract our control, we should have a positive amount of fish. And what you do is you take the average pre-restoration and compare it to the average post-restoration. And this filters out a lot of noise that's common among the basins, such as climatic factors or even different sampling techniques that are applied to both basins. And so we can summarize the information this way. This is the difference pre-restoration, the average difference pre-restoration, meaning that there were more fish in Murderers Creek pre-restoration. And then that switch, post-restoration, we actually have more fish in Bridge Creek. relative to our control. So this equates to about 60 fish per 100-meter increase. Survival, we can do the same thing, but we use a ratio instead of a difference. And so a ratio less than 1 means survival is higher in our control. And what you can see here, pre-restoration, our survival is higher in Murderers Creek pre-restoration. And then it's flipped again. Post-restoration, we see increase in survival relative to our control. And again, this is significant. Here's growth. We actually see the opposite response here. We see growth was higher in Bridge Creek pre-restoration, and now it's higher, well, similar to what it is in Murderers post-restoration. So what's going on here? Well, we're seeing a density-dependent response here. In both our treatment and control watersheds, as we increase the number of fish, we're decreasing our growth rate. So is this compensating for the effects that we might see due to changes in survival and abundance? Well, we need a metric that kind of combines all these, and production, which is grams per meter squared per season, is basically the product of survival, abundance, and growth. And this cumulative metric demonstrates that pre-restoration there really was no difference between Bridge and Murderers, but post-restoration we see an increase in Bridge Creek, suggesting we are increasing steelhead production due to the restoration. Okay, why is this occurring? I wanted to highlight the fish response first because that was the main purpose of this study, is to try to improve conditions for fish. And it is one of the few examples I know of where we actually can document a population level response to stream restoration. So let's try to talk about why. We need the mechanisms to be able to extrapolate this information. So here's a structure. This is really only 6 months after we put these structures in. What we see is aggradation behind the structure, a scour pool below the structure. Behind here is a big dam pool that's fairly deep over my waders, so I'm not going to walk over there to demonstrate that. But what we're seeing is we've increased our variability in water depths and increased our velocities. And again, this allows fish to make the decision, where's the best place for me to forage, where's the best place for me to rest, and so on. What's another response? Well, here's an aerial view. Here's a beaver dam. And what we see is we simply have increased the amount of habitat. Here's the old channel, and this is after the beaver dam. And I already showed that fish are preferring the beaver dam. So for a given stream length, we've increased the width considerably. We've created more habitat. So that could be one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in abundance. Here's another aerial view, and here's the old channel. We've created a lot of side channels, so we've created complexity side channels. Side channels are really important for rearing of young of the year fish. They're able to avoid high flow events, increase their survival rate greatly. We're seeing frequent inundation of floodplains. Here's the main channel, and here is a floodplain that was covered with sagebrush that's now getting inundated every high flow event now. And that started happening only 3 years after the restoration. Here's another picture showing frequent inundation, and here's the old channel. This is resulting first in the death of this of sagebrush, and then the recruitment of willows. In fact, BLM are now realizing that they can actually grow cottonwood and willow, which they've been trying to do for about 2 decades and haven't been able to do it. But now they're being able to recruit plants there because we are inundating this area. Well, the beavers are anyways. So, summary of results. We have produced aggradation by building these beaver dam structures, and beaver dams have occupied about 60% of these dams and are maintaining them. This is mitigating for some of the channel incision. We've increased that crest height, we've increased the stream bottom, and we're frequently inundating the floodplain. We have documented with wells and pressure transducers, much like Carol Evans talked about, increase in groundwater storage. We've seen about a 10-centimeter increase in the height of the groundwater every year. We've increased riparian vegetation. We're getting a lot of cottonwood and willow now. We've increased the quantity of fish habitat, and perhaps more importantly, the complexity of fish habitat. By changing the topography, we're getting multiple channels. We have a huge range of velocities now from slow water to fast water, shallow water, deep water. These changes in velocity are allowing for patchiness of substrates. We're getting gravels now that are recruiting that are being used by adults for building redds. Before it was just all cobble. And we are seeing changes in temperature, not so much at the reach scale. It's often thought that beaver dams are going to warm up the water. We're not seeing any changes in water temperature, except that we get some cold water upwellings that are up to 10 degrees cooler. So again, we're increasing the temperature variability that fish can make decisions of where to best regulate their temperatures. And an increase in cover. The dams themselves are providing cover. So that has resulted in a population increase in abundance, survival, a decrease in growth, but overall an increase in steelhead production without sacrificing fish passage. With these antennas and such, we can show that adults and juveniles are crossing these dams with no problem. So when we think of approaches to mitigate for these historic land uses, we're trying to promote cheap and cheerful approaches, and there's a couple posters of all other cheap and cheerful approaches. And the approach that we're highlighting here is trying to get beavers to do the work for us. These critters were extirpated nearly 100 years ago, and probably one of the first impacts to European settlement that we need to start taking into account. But we need to start employing them. I think they're much better engineers than we are, and they basically work for twigs. So with that, I'll take any questions. Right. Yeah, how have grazing practices changed in Bridge Creek, and how might that affect beavers? Yeah, BLM did remove pretty much all the grazing so this is on BLM land. And I think that was key to allowing beavers to come back into the system and to get some recruitment of riparian vegetation, but there's virtually no grazing since 1980s. Yeah, we believe there's definitely an increase in beaver populations just if you count the number of dams. There are a lot more dams than prior to the restoration. And like I mentioned, you can see kind of a delay in our control reaches where we have a lot of beaver dams now that we didn't have before. But if you just count the number of actual beaver dams made by beavers, there's still more than there's ever been in that 40-year time series. Yeah, is there a size limit to how these structures will work? Yes, I imagine there is a size limit, and there is a size limit to how big a stream beavers can build dams in as well. And Wally McFarland will be talking about a tool used to assess the ability for beavers to do restoration through the whole state of Utah. And one of the variables that goes into that model is stream power. And so beaver has to be able to build a dam across the stream, and it has to be able to withstand these floods. So, yeah, I think there's definitely going to be a limitation to how effective these things will be in terms of encouraging beavers to build dams.
Is that very many of these to be adopted by beaver? And if so, is there any rhyme or reason to which ones they seem to adopt and which ones they ignore?
Yeah, so beavers do adopt them very readily. That's where the majority of their dams that they're building are. So of the 140 that we've put in, they've built dams on about 60 of them. In terms of where to do it, we're still trying to get a handle on that. And sometimes you put a structure in and they'll build a dam 3 feet away saying, I don't, what were you thinking?
I went to a workshop in 2010, and Joe was here, he went to it also called State of the Beaver. And it was an excellent beaver workshop. They're gonna do it again in 015, in Portland. And it's being sponsored by the Cow Creek tribe of the Umpqua Indians. So you can get on Cow Creek, I think it's cowcreek.org, yeah, I think is their website. If anyone's interested, they were amazing workshops, if you want to learn about beaver.
Yeah. I've heard about that workshop. I haven't actually been, but everybody that's worked on this project has been. For some reason I don't get an invitation. I don't notice.
Yeah, you expressed your fish density increases in numbers per linear
Yes.
100 meters. Have you calculated on, square meter basis, do the densities go up on a square meter basis or?
Yeah, not nearly as much as you might expect. Oh, so why are we using basically fish per linear distance instead of fish per area as a response? Yeah, the response isn't as great as because area is actually increasing faster than the fish are. But I think a more honest assessment of whether this is working as a restoration tool, it makes more sense to do it as fish per 100 meters because you're still working with the same amount of stream. Are you increasing the fish population is what we're asking. Maybe not on a fish per meter squared, but certainly on a fish per meter we are.
One more question?
So we've seen in Grand Canyon and other areas that beaver really like native species and they won't use non-native species. So there's actually a selective pressure there. Have you seen at this point that like species composition shifts from fewer natives to more non-natives because of the increasing beaver?
Are we seeing a change from native to non-native plants due to beavers being choosy? No, we've seen actually probably an increase in willow species, which are the native species there, and that's what the system is dominated by. But, as John Stella has shown that beaver gnawing on twigs, gnawing on willow branches and stuff can often increase the stem density. So if anything, we're probably seeing an increase in the native species.
I think we're going to have to.
Okay.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks.